it is my pleasure to introduce Sister Joan Penzenstadler, an alumna from the class of 1967, who currently serves as the Vice President of the Mission and Identity at Mount Mary. So, Sister Joan.
Thank you, Sierra. And I'm so happy to be with you all today. I'm going to share my screen and explain a little bit of what I would like to do. Okay, I hope you can all see that. I was thrilled when Carrie asked if I would be willing to do a presentation to the alums, and I've been thinking about this a lot. It's been on my mind and heart through the summer with all of the racial unrest. We had a prayer service on campus, etc. And I kept thinking, how did we, School Sisters of Notre Dame, get to where we are today? What has led us? And so that I would just like to share that with you today and see how this fits with your own awakening consciousness. So the School Sisters of Notre Dame are women who dared to take the gospel seriously. A definition of vocation that you might have heard is where one's deep gladness meets the world's great hunger. That deep gladness of SSND has always been in the liberating spirit of Jesus. That gladness met the deep hungers in society, and the sisters responded with the gift of education that they had to offer. But this had to awaken it, like all of us, you know, you get one glimpse and you try to meet that. And then there's another wave and another. And I think of it often as we are continually trying to catch up to God. So that gladness met the deep hungers in society. And then we responded in that first wave in the early 1800s, when society had broken down in Bavaria. Mother Teresa, our foundress, and the first sisters focused on girls and women because they saw the urgent need to build up families in Bavaria. Isn't it interesting that that's still a focus, huh? Girls and women. Because they were rooted in the gospel, their desire to serve went beyond national boundaries. And that's the other thing about the gospel. The gospel doesn't know boundaries. They were called to North America, where the need to educate immigrants was a tremendous hunger, gnawing at the society that was forming. Here, they educated students from many different cultures. So consciousness was again expanded. Can you imagine? I mean, they knew German, then they learned English. And then here came all these other immigrants from all kinds of other countries. And to make space for all of that difference, the gospel, as I said, knew no boundaries. SSND effort helped to create the Catholic school system, raising immigrants from poverty to become influential leaders, contributing to the building of the country. What happens over time, though, is that the very structures that were built to channel the energy of the spirit can become calcified into the status quo. It wasn't status quo in this picture. This was frontier. They need then, though, when it becomes status quo, to continually stretch and look with fresh eyes. If that does not happen, the transformative element is lost. We were at one of those transformative junctures in the 1960s. And I think we're at one of those opening points right now. Very specifically, I have to say, I think not only is our country at one of those opening points, But SSND is, as the sisters in this area move to Trinity Woods and begin to open up to intergenerational living, something that has not happened before. It's a truly exciting time. The sisters were aware of needs they could address. It took time to open more and more fully to Jesus' words. This is in the Gospel of Luke. I have come to proclaim liberty to captives and to let the oppressed go free. Those words hold dimensions of meaning today that were not apparent in the past. That's been a new awakening. So in this presentation, I'd like to briefly trace the unfolding of SSND social consciousness through one lens, the lens of racial justice. From the beginning, Mothers Teresa and then Caroline were attuned to those living on the margins of society. How to address their needs through education manifested in several attempts. I look at Mother Teresa in the 1850s and how she took in girls who had been rescued from the slave trade in southern Sudan. This is a painting that was done in 1858 for the 25th anniversary of the founding of the School Sisters. Mother Teresa saw these girls as, this is how she saw it, this was her time, as human souls to care for and win over for Christ. But she didn't have a clue about their culture and what they needed, really needed to thrive. Most of these girls died young, and Mother Teresa felt terrible about that. She reflected and said, no, what we need to do is not call these little ones to come over to our country. They don't know the food, the culture. What we need to do is go to their country and try to set up education there. And you know, that's happening. We are in southern Sudan today, trying to learn what the people, the hungers of the people in southern Sudan are and how we can respond to them and meet the God who's already there. Through the decades, we have awakened considerably to what the gospel and Catholic social teaching are demanding of us. This is a copy of our Constitution titled You Are Sent, and it states, and we recognize that as individuals and as a congregation, we participate in social sin. We are called to acknowledge our contribution to injustices in the world. God's grace enables us to counteract these tendencies and to foster within ourselves and in society an attitude of humility and sharing in order to bring about a more just and humane world. Mother Caroline had personal encounters with African Americans that marked her for the rest of her life. As she established schools in the Deep South, she saw slaves for the first time. In 1858, she was traveling up the Mississippi on this very boat, the Pennsylvania, when there was an explosion which destroyed the entire superstructure from the wheels forward. That's why I wanted to show you a sketch of this boat. From the wheels forward, the entire boat was just in shambles. The chimneys had collapsed and the wheelhouse had broken into pieces. She was standing in shock when an African-American man gave her a life preserver and put a rope in her hand, which she used to board a wooden flat that saved her life. She was in the water of the Mississippi for 8 hours with body parts and debris and flames all around. There had been a flood, so they couldn't land on the shore. When she finally boarded another ship that was taking her home, she poured out her tears as women surrounded her to comfort her and give her some travel money. She was most touched when a slave girl pressed $5 into her hand. She told the girl, she wrote this later, so we have her words. She wrote and said, "I can't take this money from you." And the girl replied, "I am a slave, but not poor. And you should know that slaves also can do good." This whole traumatic experience haunted Mother Caroline, and she never forgot that slave girl who had spoken to her. I know you can't really read the slide, but I just put it on here because these are excerpts from a newspaper on the East Coast that recorded the explosion on the ship. And you can see that yellow highlights, that's her name. It lists all the survivors. Most of the people perished, but a one Caroline Fries survived this trip. Right after the Civil War, Mother Caroline sent sisters to Quincy, Illinois, to teach in a school for African-American children. One of these sisters was Sister Herlinda Sick, who in 1867 taught a little boy named Augustus Tolton. He became the first African-American to be ordained a priest in the Catholic Church. She helped him realize his dignity as one who was made in the image and likeness of God. And it sure wasn't always easy for him, the prejudice he met, but he fondly recalled his time with her and remarked, "As long as I was in that school, I was safe." Like Mothers Teresa and Caroline, the School Sisters of Notre Dame continued many times falteringly. We had to learn. We are learning still. We have so many blind spots, but we are trying to follow the gospel. Oftentimes, this is not a clear path, but rather an inner impetus to move in a certain direction. It would take 100 years before there was a massive awakening of our consciousness. In the 1960s, the mandates of the Second Vatican Council, which was held in the Vatican outside of Rome, dovetailed with the major social upheavals and transitions prevalent in that era, especially in the United States. Isn't it interesting how there needs to be a right time? Theologians call it the Kairos time, the time of God, when there's a convergence in our thinking, in our spirituality, in what's happening in the times. That's why I think we're in one of those places right now. But in the 1960s, the Vietnam War, the war on poverty, the civil rights movement, and the women's movement jerked the country out of its 1950s idyllic complacency and shook the nation into re-examining its own ideals and its bedrock principles of equality and justice for all. Women religious were far from immune from these social struggles, and emboldened by the mandates and optimism of the Vatican Council, they saw these events through the lens of gospel imperatives and as significant opportunities to live their Catholic faith and religious identity in the modern world. And so I just put up there 5 of those mandates in the gospel itself that the sisters took hold of in a new way. Words from Martin Luther King Jr. stirred the sisters anew to see how the gospel might be lived. Martin Luther King said, "So often, the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound." King went on, "So often, it is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silent and often even vocal sanction of things as they are." Wow. This was not a description of the church that women religious believed in. There was this great awakening. No, we are women of the gospel. I often think, what was it really that got Jesus killed? Right? Jesus was firmly rooted in his Jewish heritage, but he saw that that heritage was meant to liberate people. He saw that his beloved Abba was calling for liberty and an inclusive, beloved community. In the 1960s, more was being studied and written about the role of religious life in the church. That's when I entered. So I was on the cutting edge of this as a very young, in boot camp of religious life. We discovered that we were meant to see and speak from the margins of society. That was the place of women religious. That we are part of the prophetic dimension of the church. And a prophet is one who feels the feelings of God. We felt that. When Martin Luther King Jr. asked sisters and clergy to join in the march on Selma in 1965, the School Sisters of Notre Dame responded. I was in the novitiate, so we were pretty far removed, but we wrote letters of support to those marching. And our novice director, Sister Jean Marie, had a way to get our letters to Sister Margaret Ellen Traxler, a School Sister of Notre Dame, who would see to it that they were distributed in Selma. By the end of that seminal year, Selma veteran Sister Margaret Ellen would be on the National Catholic Conference for Interracial Justice. She was director of the new Department of Educational Services, organizing sisters to work in summer and full-time programs in the South to alleviate racism and poverty, and writing for Extension magazine and echoing the sentiments of many at the time. Sister Margaret Ellen wrote, "After Selma, sister, you can't stay home again." Now, in some circles, Milwaukee, I found out, was known as the Selma of the North. The School Sisters of Notre Dame were staffing many of the Catholic schools in Milwaukee that were experiencing the effects of the Great Migration. And Sister Marie LeClaire Laux, whom you see here, was principal of one of those schools, St. Boniface. She, with many who were working in what was then called the inner core, could see the effects of segregation firsthand and believed that the documents of the Vatican Council gave them approval for their social justice activities. They also felt empowered to exercise their own consciousnesses in light of the gospel. Reflecting on her participation in the housing marches, Sister Marie LeClaire said that many white people in the community couldn't understand why the sisters were getting involved in Black issues. And she said, we knew that in order to be part of the Black community where the sisters were living and teaching, they had to be part of the Black concern. Notice the change in habit during this time as well. And by the way, that was part of the mandate of the Vatican Council. They said, the sisters are those who live on the margins with people, and they need to identify with the people with whom they serve. So we are asking them to transition from their garb of the Middle Ages to something that would be more identifiable with the people. The Sisters of St. Boniface understood that if their students were going to be successful, the teachers needed to make some changes. Sister Marie LeClaire reflected, this is a quote from her, and as these years kept going on, we knew we were going to have to change our way of teaching, change our attitudes, change the way we understood, change our whole way of life, as a matter of fact. The sisters wanted to help the children, but first they had to help themselves learn how to best serve the students. The sisters used books that better reflected the lives of their students and began to incorporate a sense of cultural identity into the curriculum by emphasizing Black contributions to American society. That hadn't been done before. Let's open up our history. Sister Marie LeClaire was convinced that the School Sisters of Notre Dame had a mission which was to transform the world through education and to educate the whole person. As an SSND, she understood the power of education. That was her deep gladness. She was committed to seeing that each child, regardless of religion or race, had access to a good education. That was her gladness, meeting a deep hunger in our society. She said, education will transform people, and the right education will transform them into loving, responsible people. Following the gospel took on dimensions that Mother Teresa could never have imagined in the 1840s. Mount Mary was in sync with this expanded consciousness. Under SSND leadership, back then called the college, established new services poised to serve a growing, diverse population. New courses were created. One, for example, was teaching in a multicultural society. New opportunities invited interactions with leaders and organizations in Milwaukee. And new student organizations were established. For example, the Coretta Scott King organization. The sisters were at the forefront of these initiatives. Funding opportunities helped Mount Mary develop partnerships with the education departments of Marquette, Cardinal Stritch, and Alverno to offer a tuition-free program to 100 Milwaukee public school teachers in which students could participate. Each week, national level speakers from various cultural groups addressed the class and led challenging discussions that enriched everyone present. On the right, some of you might recognize that's the president's office with Sister Mary Nora Barber in the center there. Mount Mary had begun with a set of aims in the early years of the college. This was hand lettered in the 1930s. And it begins, the primary purpose of Mount Mary College is the Christian formation of young women. It aims, by means of intellectual and moral training, to enable its young women students to meet the problems and issues of our society. In the 1970s, these aims, then called beliefs, were reworked, leading to one that stated, Mount Mary, as a small women's college located in a metropolitan area, recognizes that it bears a responsibility to the community in which it exists. This responsibility manifests itself in a social consciousness, which the student develops not only through college experiences, but also through those experiences which extend beyond the classroom into the community. The aims, then it was called beliefs, developed into the mission statement, which is the precursor to the current one. And that precursor read, Mount Mary is a Catholic college for women whose mission is to provide an academic base rooted in the liberal arts and to develop women of conviction, sensitive to Christian principles and moral and aesthetic values, and competent to take a place as educated women in the community at large, to lead and to accept responsibility for the attainment of social justice. So gradually, that Catholic sense of who we are became deeper and deeper into living in a just and inclusive community. After the Second Vatican Council, the School Sisters of Notre Dame rewrote their constitution. I told you the name of it is You Are Sent, and it reflects our growing consciousness. One paragraph states, a particular concern in all ministries is the establishment of a just society. We call ourselves and others to embody gospel values and to live the social teachings of the church. Working toward the enablement of persons and the promotion of human dignity, we contribute to positive systemic change. At this moment in our SSND story, we are continually trying to awaken to what the gospel demands of us as Catholic Christians. We stand with a vibrant Mary. I'm sure, well, I'm not sure, but I'm thinking a lot of you have seen this mural, which is outside of the dining room. And we encourage educational endeavors that open students to issues of racial justice, integrity of creation, human life, and dignity. So as the Vice President for Mission and Identity at Mount Mary, my goal is to incorporate these gospel values and the SSND charism into the life of the university in collaboration with all members of the campus community. And so we continue on this pilgrimage of awakening, of fully living our faith in light of the gospel mandates, always stretching to catch up to God. So thank you for letting me share the story as far as we are in it. And interesting to tell you, I said this before the meeting began, that from 10 o'clock till 11, Mount Mary students, faculty, staff are going to be lining the corner of 92nd and Burleigh in league with a Catholic organization called Black Lives Are Sacred. Our Asian organization, our Hispanic organizations, our Black Student Union are all joining in this effort. It is an hour of prayer, reflecting together who we are as a community at Mount Mary. So thank you.
Thank you, Sister Joan, for that beautiful presentation. It was very informative and very thought-provoking. So thank you so much for being here with us today.